The meeting will finish at 8:30. I promise not to overrun. I know lots of people are spending far too much time in front of screens at the moment, so we will be finishing at 8:30. Between now and then, we have 3 speakers, and they'll speak for 10 minutes each to give us a good dose of information from the work that they've been involved in. Between now and then, I've got to give you one dose of information, and it comes from the Action on Empty Homes recent report, Pretty Vacant. In it, we estimate that there are at least 120,000 plus underutilised properties in London. That's 25,000 long-term empty homes, 45,000 second homes, and at least 50,000 whole house Airbnbs. So we have enough housing. So perhaps the issue may not be how it's distributed and what it's being used for. Now, our speakers have promised to keep to 10 minutes because they're all interested in the questions and thoughts that you'll have in response to their introductions. So we'll have 50 minutes for questions and answers and discussions in a question time format. We'll hear from each of them in turn. So if you have a particular question from the first speaker, then send it to us on Facebook or YouTube, or the second or third speaker, and we'll pick some of them. Now, we can't promise to pick every question, but what we'll do is pick the ones that we think will lead to the better discussion. If you want to make a discussion point, i.e. you don't want to ask a question, but you want to just make a general point, then please write it down on YouTube or Facebook, and we will do our best to put it in the mix. Our 3 speakers in reverse order are Loretta Lees, who will introduce on the erasure of council estates in London. The second speaker is Rex McKenzie, who will talk about wealth chain investment in London. But we start with Rowland Atkinson, who will speak on the curse of living in Alpha City. Rowland.
Thank you very much, Will, and welcome to everybody tonight who's listening in. So I'm going to speak just for 10 minutes, so I'm going to be ruthlessly on time as best I can. And I suppose what I'm going to do is kind of give you a kind of big picture opening, building on the book that I've just had out, which is really about how wealth has and the wealthy have damaged London, particularly over the last decade. Obviously, I'm speaking on a day when we've had it's actually the second Russia report, because the Russia gold report, which talked a lot about money laundering and super rich Russians, amongst others, throwing money at housing in the city. That came out almost exactly 2 years ago, which also provided some eye-watering sort of insight into what's been going on in the city. And both of those reports sort of reflect on how London's desire to be open for business, to sort of throw doors open wide to money and those people who hold it, has in many ways damaged the kind of institutional landscape in the city. And all of that is actually very much tied up with the question of empty homes. I'll come back to that in a moment. The sense of what I call necrotecture, dead architecture, dead residential space, which has been produced in a city where money has been sort of rolling in enormously so over the last decade, and that's created this fantastic on one level development landscape, well over sort of 500 towers in one stage of completion or another in the city, but much of that being captured by people investing, people looking for space, not necessarily to live, but either to make money or just simply to hold that space empty. So I'm starting off then with this sense that this wealth is casting a kind of actually a long shadow over the city. It is not a case of the rich floating all boats. In many ways, the tidal wave of money that's ripped through the city over the last decade has made life more difficult. And I think Loretta and Rex are going to come on to expand on some of those issues in their presentations. So we've seen rising costs, particularly in terms of housing, as money has flowed into the top of the market, which has actually sort of cascaded down through the city more broadly. But a key argument in the book is not simply that the city is a kind of rich patchwork of, rich and poor living side by side and so on. It's to say that there's actually a relationship between those outcomes, and that the relationship fundamentally operates through a group of enablers who operate in terms of the political elite, in terms of corporate planning, law, real estate, and development. And they have mediated this process in ways that have allowed money on the one hand to roll in, meanwhile devastating in many cases communities and sub-districts of the city where we've seen extensive demolition, we've seen huge amounts of household displacement, and a significant amount of social pain on the back of that that's often not recognized, I think, by people in certain sections of those elites more broadly. So the point here is that depending on which side of that fence that you sit on, whether you're, let's say, in the 1% or a fraction of that 1%, or living in the rest of the city, it's either been a decade of austerity, of pain, of the loss of core social services and so on. And for those people with plenty of money, this has been a wonderful period of time. You know, it's the stock market has blossomed, development activity has flourished, producing luxury apartments and so on. And none of that really has benefited not just the poor and the more excluded groups within the city, but actually really quite high up the income spectrum in terms of people feeling locked out of those kind of opportunities. Even those people who may themselves be relatively wealthy, concerned about what's happening and the futures of their own cities. Underpinning all of that is this sense that particularly followed the last financial crisis, which echoes what we're seeing right now, is this sense that, look, we're in crisis, we need the rich, we need offshore money to kind of reinflate the city economy. We need that to fund new housing, but of course that created housing that nobody could kind of afford. So it was a kind of illusory sort of process that was not delivering. So I've written a kind of briefing for sort of housing activists and others, sort of concerned citizens, if you like, which sort of just sets out the core arguments of the book, which you can download for free. And it talks about the wealth octopus. For those of you interested in sort of private renting and so on, you'll know that there was an image from the early part of the 20th century which talked about private landlordism as this sort of subterranean monster that's kind of sucking the life and soul out of the city. And I think that sort of, I've got nothing against octopuses, I should say, but that sort of image of something vampiric, something that is taking without contributing, I think is particularly relevant to where we find ourselves in the here and now, the kind of COVID moment. I'll come back to what I think of where we might be going in the future here. But the book makes a series of core arguments, and Loretta is going to be talking about this erasure of the poor in a moment. But I think it's been easier to advance arguments of cutting, of austerity and all the rest of it when there has been this sort of headlong rush to encourage the rich, to encourage capital investment into the city, and also to reduce support for various kind of core social services. So the city has lost, for example, over the last decade or so, around about 50 public libraries, 54 playing fields, I think it's around 30 or more hospitals and care homes and so on. All this is kind of catalogued in the book. But this is also a space in which, you know, these wonderful kind of new developments, the West End of the city and other core districts of the city, allow the very wealthy to feel insulated, to feel distant from the consequences of the austerity that's been unleashed on the city more broadly. And that's a real problem, I think, where people do not feel connected to other people. They do not feel connected to the kind of problems that have been generated by a lot of the welfare changes, a lot of the housing policy changes that have been kicking in over the last decade or so. So we've seen, if you like, the wrong kind of trickle down. Many of the city's citizens paying more for less. Private rented sector is a complete disaster zone. Anyone who has experience of competing for housing in that market will know how stressful that is, how poor quality it is, how badly managed it is. We've seen the production of a lot of lower cost new construction, which is incredibly poor quality. All of those kind of things operating within a city that's sort of at full tilt, if you like. All of this, and this echoes what we've been a lot of people have been talking about in the news today with the Erasure report, facilitating elite criminality, the sense that the state has defunded, it has deregulated, is not interested in tracking down where illicit money is flowing from and to, because it actually, of course, props up on our heavily financialized city economy. So our own National Crime Agency estimates that around 100 billion circulates in the UK annually. That's illicit money. Much of that is used to invest in property in the city and elsewhere across the UK. Highly problematic, but no great interest in funding, actions that would seek to sort of challenge that. So then finally, this sense of dead space, which Rex and Loretta will be talking about in a moment, the production of necrotecture, the underuse of property, people maybe coming for 2 weeks of the year, for example. I forget how many tens of thousands are supposed to be of apartments are supposed to be in the new high-rise stuff that's coming into the city. But, again, how much of that's either going to be left empty, not sort of contributing to the core needs of housing supply? And why do we never see public housing? I'm a fierce advocate for public housing. Why do we never see public housing really being produced as part of those developments? So I've got 1 minute and 40 seconds to finish. I sat down today thinking about the Russia report, thinking about what's going on with COVID and so on, and just sort of sketched out where the city, and not just London, of course, we're seeing skyscrapers being built in Leeds and Manchester, which kind of mirror the London model. We're seeing Chinese investment rolling into the north of England and so on. I think on the wealth taxation, which I would say is the core of the agenda, that's what we need to tap into if we're going to get the resources to deliver the kind of housing system that we need. The good news is that there is oodles of cash out there. There are trillions, tens of trillions held offshore. That's, in a sense, what we need to go after. But the second point, I think, and it's a really critical one, that with this talk of a vaccine, if we get a vaccine, memories are going to be very, very short. We're going to be back to the bad normal. We're going to be back to arguments about, look, in the post-crisis of COVID, we need the rich, we need the philanthropists, we need capital investment and all the rest. All those debates about what kind of housing, who it's for and so on, I think are again going to get sidelined. Regulation, policing, I think there's going to be no great interest in some of that, or indeed a lot of it, in terms of laundering, city fraud, tax evasion and all the rest of it. Indeed, the government itself is consulting on the creation of 12, I think, free ports, so tax-free jurisdictions onshore where people can store, let's say, wine, art, and all the rest of it. So the agenda is actually sort of low tax, low regulation, not to really sort of challenge a lot of these kind of problems. Planning reform, I think, is going to go nowhere particularly. All the questions that people ask about viability testing, social housing contribution, and all the rest of it, I don't see any of that happening, particularly the generic scandal, massive scandal actually, which I think if we weren't talking about COVID would have been much more pronounced, has highlighted a lot of the kind of mechanisms at work here. So just wrapping up, on the philanthropist wealthy, I think they will be embraced just as they have been very emphatically over the last 10 years. We might say, well, pay your taxes rather than contribute through charitable contributions, I think. And finally, I think we will not see the promotion and funding of social housing in ways that really address core needs around quality, professional management, security of tenure, and all the rest of it. So I shall leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. I'm going to move us quickly on. I'm saying if you've got questions or comments, please put them up on YouTube or Facebook, and we'll feed them in when we've heard the three speakers. Our next speaker is Rex McKenzie, who will introduce the subject of wealth chain investment in London. Over to you, Rex.
Thank you, Will. Rowland has just presented the big picture. I am going to present a micro picture of how some aspects of what he was discussing work on the ground. I work with an idea called wealth chains that I appropriated from Seabrook and Wigan. For definitional purposes, a wealth chain investment allows high wealth entities to circumvent taxation obligations, thereby boosting profits and lowering transaction costs. of necessity, they involve tax havens. Now, one of the things about the tax haven literature is that we think of exotic small islands as tax havens, but we don't think of places like Luxembourg, Ireland, etc., as tax havens. My work suggests that in the area of houses, homes, and properties in England and Wales, they are very much so. I want to talk, okay, so the wealth chain idea is the idea that there are asset managers, lawyers, accountants, bankers, and architects and local councils who are involved in a chain of activities that move money from tax havens into our cities. Tonight, I want to talk very briefly about the architects, or one architect in one case. I want to talk about Squire and Partners, who are conducting, they're bespoke architects, and they're conducting a renovation in Brixton. This is the renovation that they're conducting. It's a mock-up of it. They build large new offices, bar and restaurants. In this case, it's on Stockwell Avenue. And those people who know Brixton will know that place very well. The company moved in and bought up, I have no idea how long Bon Marsh had been in Brixton. They had been there ever since I was a schoolboy. And they moved in and bought it up and started to renovate it. Bon Marsh is now called a department store, and it includes Canova Hall, a bar and a restaurant, and has an exclusive roof terrace where the elite can go and drink. It's only for the elite because in order to drink there, you have to pay £240 for the year, and you have to be vetted. On their Twitter feed, Squire and Partners on November the 8th had this rather curious statement. We were delighted to advise on the new color ways for the new Ferndale Road hashtag wayfinding by South London artist Lionel Stanhope. It looks fantastic. Colors reference the green copper roofs and the red brick of the surrounding streets. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. Please note the hashtag community, because that is what I want to come back to. When we undertook work in, that's myself and Rowland undertook work sometime last year to do with Kensington and Chelsea, we came across another bespoke architect, Fletcher Priest. Fletcher Priest were responsible for the K1 Knightsbridge Estate regeneration project. And the idea of the regeneration project was to reinvigorate, restore, and celebrate the block above Knightsbridge Station. This is pretty much the argument that Squire is using in Brixton. It is to regenerate Brixton, make the place nicer, etc., etc. In this case, in the Fletcher Priest case, they had new offices, same as Squire, 35 residential flats, an underground car park, and a rooftop garden. It seems roofs are very important, and a restaurant. Now, the important thing is that what happened was that Fletcher Priest were able to go before the council, the local council, and argue a sort of a different, argue a case for not building affordable houses. You were supposed to build some amount of affordable housing when you have these developments. And they basically argued that it was unfeasible and that they would prefer to pay a fine, and the local council accepted it. So they paid, I believe, 12 million instead of building any affordable housing. So we found out in the end that the money that they paid to the local council had not been used as of 2019. We don't know why, but we found that the money was in the local council's coffers. So no libraries, no improvements in air quality, sports facilities, healthcare, anything like that was undertaken. This is not, in my opinion, very good for our local residents or the local community. So I want to ask this question. I want to leave you with this. Okay, so this is in the UK between 1952 and 2018, the population increased by 33%. The supply went up by approximately 95%, and the price went up by approximately 352%. What I want to ask, given those numbers that we see, is building more homes going to fix that? I'm trying to suggest that what is really happening is these regeneration projects, these bespoke architects and their many different partners are adding to the costs for local residents. So in point of fact, what has happened in the Brixton case is the original residents are no longer in Brixton. You find many of the original residents, long-term residents, have moved. They are now in Croydon. They are now in Shirley. They are now on the outskirts of London. What I'm suggesting here is that the local council and policy in general is to encourage this type of regeneration because it is good for the area. I'm going to leave it to people to decide whether it is in fact good for the area. And I'm going to suggest, if you're interested in this type of analysis, there are two books, one by my friend Tim Gooding on Economics for a Fairer Society, published last year, and then there's a Cachet working paper which deals directly with the question of housing supply. With that, I am approximately 1 minute early, so I will leave it right there. Thank you.
And thank you for that. Thank you, Rex, for a really good presentation and for being a minute early. I'm gonna now move us on to Loretta Lees, and who's going to speak about the erasure of council estates in London.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Okay, so the title is The Erasure of London Council Estates, but equally I could also title this The State-Led Gentrification of London Council Estates. And one of the reasons I want to bring in this term gentrification is A, because this is something I've been working on for well over 20 years, both in London but also beyond London. But equally because it's a term that for policymakers often has positive connotations, but for people living in the areas impacted by it, it tends to be a negative process that causes displacement. So what I want to talk about tonight is a project that I've just completed with some others, Phil Hubbard at King's College London, Nick Tate at the University of Leicester, and partners, the London Tenants Federation and Just Space, where we've looked at the demolition of council estates in London since 1997. So the database that we've developed that's come out of this project has shown that since 1997, in estates that have over 100 units, and we've chosen larger estates that have over 100 units, 161 estates and 198 separate schemes on those estates have caused some form of demolition and displacement. So in this data, we've calculated that 54,262 units of council housing have been demolished, and we figure at a kind of approximation of, say, 2.8 people living in these units, a kind of minimum amount of people being displaced is about 151,000 people. This is significantly higher than media accounts, which had been kind of floating a figure of 50,000. So we can see a serious number of people being displaced from council estates in London. Now, these estates are replaced with new build, supposedly mixed income developments. And the database that we've collated also shows that these new build developments are very, very different. Now, across the board, they're about 2% council homes, 25% social rent, which is not council rent. And we have to be clear, there's a big difference between social rent and council rent. Council rent is the lowest rent you're liable to be able to pay. Social rent is usually housing association rent that's often higher. 15% affordable, 4% intermediate, 4% split ownership, so shared ownership, part rent, part own, and 54% market rate sold off into owner occupation. So you can see that council estates and council properties as we know them are being erased. Now, of course, this is in a wider context of the kind of hyper-gentrification that's going on in London, the kind of processes that both Rowland and Rex have just talked about. So just to give you an example of some of these major schemes, so some of the sites where there's been 1,000+ demolitions in terms of units, we have the Aylesbury estate, South Acton estate in Ealing, Woodbury Down in Hackney, Kidbrooke Village, which was Ferrier estate in Greenwich, Gascoigne estate East in Barking, etc., etc. The Haygate estate, which became symbolic of this whole process of state-led gentrification. If you look at the map at the top, you can see the little red dots show that this is happening all over London, but of course it has more of a concentration in the kind of inner boroughs. We tried to get a sense of where people were moving to, which proved to be very difficult. We tried lots of different data sets and in the end ended up looking at linked consumer registers, which look at data like loyalty card data, credit reporting, etc., and are linked to administrative records. And you can see here that the kind of post-regeneration flows from estates that have been regenerated, really gentrified, are outwards. They're very much in an outwards direction. People are moved out and away from their homes. If we look at this in much more detail, there's a difference between the way that leaseholders, so people who've bought their council property through right to buy, and tenants, council tenants who are renting their property, there are different ways in which they're displaced. Leaseholders are displaced much further away, but council tenants equally are still displaced, sometimes within borough, but often outside borough as well. And even some of them can be displaced outside of London and to other cities that have relationships in inverted commas with councils in London and take some of these council tenants. Leaseholders, of course, are displaced further away because they simply can't afford to buy a similar property for the price that they get for the property from the council through CPO and have to move further out. So what does this do? We've talked about in this project a process that really creates a kind of slow violence. And it's a slow violence that empties people out, it empties people's lives, it disrupts people's lives. So I'm just going to give you a kind of flavour of some of the kind of interviews that we did with people who have been affected by this. And this is one from the Pepys estate. And it kind of gets a sense of this kind of disruption. When you have kids, one of the most important things is stability. To move somewhere far and have our support networks cut off, it's going to be a struggle for us because I do so much hours at work. It's a tough one. So there were different kinds of impacts. There were economic impacts, people losing their jobs because they had to move out, social impacts, losing their social networks, including backup for childcare and other kind of family support. There were cultural disruptions, losing their relationships with particular churches or community hubs or community centres or particular kind of ethno-cultural facilities that were in their particular neighbourhood. And there were also quite severe mental health impacts as a result of this. Quite clearly, there was a sense of loss. So this interview from somebody off the Carpenter's estate in Newham says, I mean, I was brought up here in this area. I've always lived in Newham. Newham's more sociable, you know, like it's got every multicultural people living here, a few of everyone, and I like it here. And I don't want to move out. My children don't want to move out too. And, you know, it's getting very hard to find a place, getting used to the place. Do you understand? So there's a sense of loss and a sense of fear of what people are going into as part of this displacement. Of course, these council estates that are being demolished have been categorised as brownfield sites. So in policy terms, it's almost as if people don't live there, that council estate residents don't in fact exist at all. And this was really kind of brought to my attention in the Aylesbury Public Inquiry, which I was involved in, when I discovered that one of the blocks that we were fighting to save actually had its postcode deleted. So it's almost like council estate residents, low-income groups are being erased, are being kind of emptied out of London deliberately and being replaced by a much wealthier, supposedly more mixed income population. Of course, there are democratic deficits as a result of this. So in this interview from the Love Lane estate in Tottenham, I think they sum this up quite well. It's not fair, you know, once they are doing something that big, you should have a one-to-one and you should have a solicitor and they should be talking about what's going on. We've had nothing like that. There is a consultation, in inverted commas. They're putting letters through your door telling you how it's going to be to regenerate the area, but they don't. There's no mention of demolition at all. Why not? A yes or a no vote. That is all we want. And of course, now the Mayor of London has put in kind of pressures to sign off on many of these redevelopments on condition that there is a ballot, that there is a vote, that there is some form of kind of democratic accountability and participative democracy. The problem is that people don't always get told the truth of what's actually going on. So in an attempt to kind of remedy some of this misinformation and some of these problems, we've developed a new website called estatewatch.london, and the link is up here. And on that, we've got 6 handouts, which we think are really strategic and useful resources for council estate residents faced with demolition or erasure. The first one talks about 7 reasons why we should be aware of estate regeneration, pointing out that it's not regeneration, it's usually gentrification and displacement. 2, holding on to existing council homes and keeping tenants and residents united. So keeping people united so that the kind of divide and rule tactics that councils kind of play in order to get people out don't get allowed to take hold. The third handout is on tenant-led regeneration and alternatives to demolition. So, for example, this could be refurbishment, it could be transition to community land trust or something other. Handout 4, demolition ballots. So, although we now have ballots, there are certain questions that residents on council estates need to ask themselves and of their council before they cast their vote. Handout 5 is 5 guarantees that we think leaseholders need to seek. And finally, we've got an example of a residence charter template that would help people in a situation whereby the only way out of this kind of dilemma is for them to actually take over their estate. Okay, and I hope I've kept to time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of our speakers for brilliantly keeping to time. We've got questions coming in now, which I want to put to you. Jack says, I was interested in Rowland's comment that the wealth investment seems to be spreading to Manchester and Leeds as well. Could Leeds and Manchester be on the similar path to the gentrification as we've seen in many London boroughs? And other people pitching if they want, but Rowland, what's your thought?
Yeah, I think the quick answer is obviously that a lot of things have stalled. So a lot of the development activity is simply not happening right now. And I think that it's not the case that those cities are going to see something quite as intense as you would find in London. Also, in terms of social impacts, where we have seen localized gentrification activity, I think it's fair to say that although those housing markets are straining, and public housing is also under strain in those kind of locations, people have other choices. So whereas in London, displacement in the way that Loretta's been talking about it is more or less a disaster, and in many cases people are being shipped out of the city, I think people have choices still remaining in some of the other regional centres. But that doesn't mean to say that there isn't intense anger and frustration about, for example, in Manchester, the highly development-led local economy there in terms of production of large swathes of particularly 1 and 2 bedroom high-rise apartments, much of that built to rent out. So you're not seeing necessarily a direct form of localized displacement in quite the same way. I think it's what Loretta would have called in the past new build gentrification. But so I guess, you know, this is about four years ago or so. I did some work with a colleague, and we were looking at Hong Kong investors, and there was a kind of leapfrogging of London and an increasing interest in the north of England. So through build to rent, buying to let. Some of that has fallen over. Some of it continues. So there's a kind of variegated picture. I don't think that those cities are going to become mini sort of supercharged alpha cities in quite their own way, but nevertheless, I guess we're living in unfortunately interesting times in which there's a kind of capital switching going on. So at the very top, people are suburbanizing, people are looking for country homes, people are looking for regional centres which are less congested perhaps, and you might get a better lifestyle. So there's this sort of potential resorting going on. How significant that will be in the long term, to go back to my point about short memories and vaccines and so on, I'm not really sure. So I think less intense, but locally you do find examples in which questions of displacement, the landscape of the city changing in ways that is regressive, you know, that it's symbolically challenging. People look at the landscape and say they kind of feel alienated by a lot of those kind of changes in similar way to you find what you find in London. But the growth machine of a city like Leeds is not quite as mercenary and not capable of being so mercenary, because it doesn't have the City of London. It doesn't have this sort of epicenter status that London does vis-a-vis New York, Singapore, and so on. And I think there's another question floating around that maybe comes back to some of those points.
That's right. Any thoughts about that from Loretta or Rex?
Loretta, would you like to go?
Sure, you go first and then I'll follow you.
Okay. I think I've been looking at Liverpool recently, and I think one of the big differences is that London has this financial center, the city, and the city is a key factor in the driver in terms of wealth investment in London itself. Now, we know distance is not a problem, space is not a problem, because we have the technology. But nevertheless, there is the financial center there, which is acting as a big magnet for places like Jersey, places like Guernsey, British Virgin Islands, etc. So what I'm seeing is a lot of funds coming through these places, heading to London. In Liverpool, I'm seeing a slightly different pattern. Now, the city has been, if you like, gentrified. In fact, there are now more wine bars and coffee places, etc., etc. The typical types of developments that you would see, say, in a Brixton or a Clapham. But the players are slightly different. They're not the same players that are operating in London. Okay. And what is happening in Liverpool is that the wealth extraction is taking place, if you like, not at a super rich level, but it's in places, in things like student accommodation. So Liverpool is one of the best places to rent a property, to buy a property in, because or has been up to now, because the return to the owner from rent exceeds anywhere else in the country. So up until COVID, we saw a lot of this activity taking place in Liverpool, which is slightly different from the kind of work that I did on London.
Okay.
It's a different kind of wealth extraction. towards the fringes of Merseyside, in places like St. Helens, you're seeing another type of investment. You're seeing offshore investment from multinationals, as opposed to the super rich families and family offices. And what you're seeing them doing, and I think this is something that will continue after COVID, is that they're positioning themselves for distribution points. So some of the plans are about large warehouses. Okay, so that is another large warehouses for distribution, for storage and then distribution, I suppose, around England and Wales.
Okay, Loretta?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because, I mean, I've lived in London for over 20 years, but I'm originally from Manchester and my family are originally from Salford. So I've been going back and forth there, really interested in particular about this notion of the new urban renewal. So the kind of processes I'm talking about on council estates in London, we can talk about as a kind of second urban renewal. So you had the kind of original urban renewal that built these estates in post-war slum clearance, and now they're being cleared again and they're being redeveloped. And certainly in Salford, there's been a kind of quite strategic attempt to do this. But what's really interesting is that because it's the context of London and Manchester, as Rex and Rowland have just said, is so different. You haven't got this kind of inflated kind of almost kind of already combusted property market. You've got kind of these large pockets of either stagnant or in many cases even collapsed property prices. And the state there is heavily involved, the local state, the city, in trying to kind of not only prop these up, but actually get them going. Whereas in London, we're already moving, people who are moving into the market here are moving into a situation where, it's almost taken for granted that the property values in London are going to be good. They're going to keep going up, of course, until COVID hits. And now we don't quite know what's going to happen, or Brexit. But, there's somehow been an assumption, certainly for the last decade, that it's a safe place to invest. Whereas in Manchester, in Liverpool, in places like that, it's about trying to get things going. So in many ways, I think the state have been even more heavy-handed actors than they are in London, interestingly. In London, it's just done quickly and it's done kind of, almost as a kind of taken for granted way, whereas it's been much more kind of pushy, I think, and it hasn't always succeeded. So the one thing that's been very interesting is that some of these developments have not attracted the kind of new middle class that they want to move into them, and they've ended up having to either sell them back to low-income communities or put them back into council ownership, which certainly hasn't happened yet in London, but of course there could possibly be a situation where down the line that happens, and if that happens, that's good as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, there is some talk of that actually in London about councils buying back and intervening, and it is quite promising if it comes off. I think if it comes off. Just to follow on, Frank says a question for any of the speakers, though it might be related more to Rex and Rowland's presentation. What makes London in particular a more attractive place to invest in real estate, say, than New York City, Barcelona, or Paris? What's different about London? Is it different? Who wants to pick that one up?
Yeah,
go ahead, Rowland.
I can start. I mean, there's social reasons and there are economic reasons amongst others. But I mean, London has become cheap in terms of exchange rates. That's a key factor if you're looking at investment from, say, America or Middle East, China, and so on. It's also a place that's cheap, relatively speaking, in terms of property tax. I can't give you figures right off the top of my head, but when Ken Griffin bought a couple of homes for around 100 million in London, the comments were very much around how much he was going to be paying a year in council tax compared to the annual tax levy that he would face on his properties in New York. So London is, as Loretta was saying, it's seen as a safe bet. It's seen, if you came from Russia, it would be seen as a place where, questions of legal jurisdiction, of a lack of interest in the individual by the government and so on would be seen as advantageous. So, you can have an account here and the government's not going to be looking into your affairs in quite the same way. And I think some of the kind of evidence that I would sort of bring to the table, talking to very wealthy people and so on, would suggest that, Loretta may dispute this because I know she likes New York, but I mean, I think the green space in London, the look and the feel of the place makes it a very attractive place to invest in, particularly if you're going to live there. If you're not going to live there, then you're back to the thing about it being a safe bet. You can leave the property there to sort of to run and run in terms of value. If you're laundering money, it's wonderful also in that respect, but you probably don't care as much. You're simply looking for somewhere to offload your cash until you're ready to recirculate it, come the need for a sale a bit later on. So I think there's a whole range of things, but I don't know if Rex wants to come in on any of the offshore elements of some of that stuff specifically.
Yeah, I'd just like to make the point in this way. There's a very separate point I want to make, and let me start with that first. I think London is classified as a global city, along, I think, with New York, and I'm not sure if Sydney is one, but certainly London and New York are full-fledged global cities. So they have the amenities that people would like to have, the theatres, the cinemas, etc., etc. But I think London offers something else, and I think this harks back to empire and it harks back to history. London has tremendous cultural capital, and many people from Africa, many Chinese, Russians, etc., they want to invest in London because London is London, and there is simply no other city that has that history, that background, that pomp, that ceremony that people want to be associated with. So that's the first thing. In terms of the actual capital flows themselves, Nicholas Shaxson in Treasure Islands, I think, gives the best explanation of why London. And he looks at the overseas dependent territories, which are all by and large tax havens. And he points them. He says that these actually funnel money into the banks in London. So that square mile, that city, is a big factor in the process. Now, if I am very, very wealthy, I probably want to have easy access to a very sophisticated banking center with connections with everywhere else in the world. So I think these factors, including the cultural factor, the cultural capital factor, I think very important, very kind of understated, but I think it's true. I think that would be my answer.
It almost takes you back to the East India Company, doesn't it? Really?
Exactly. Yeah. That's what I'm harking back to. Yeah. There is this sense, all you have to do is go to central London and look at the tourists that come to central London and they'll move around central London with awe on their faces. It is a big deal. And it is a big deal because nobody does anything, nobody does pomp and ceremony and pageantry as well as England, apart from maybe the French, but that's debatable.
Loretta, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, to kind of echo that, I think some of it is about history. It's about the depth of that history. Obviously, New York is a much newer city, as are all American cities, so you don't have that depth. But I think one of the other things that London has is it's quite a walkable city. It's quite a compact city. And of course, during COVID, as people stopped using public transport and started to walk more, even, people who live there now recognise that actually we don't need to take the tube, don't need to take the bus. We can actually walk from A to B in a relatively okay period of time. And certainly in some of the work on gentrification that I did a couple of years ago on super gentrification, for example, which is, kind of ultra wealthy individuals moving into already gentrified neighbourhoods, one of the things that they really valued was the proximity to many of these kind of cultural things that Rex was talking about, but also the ability to meet up face to face quickly. So, they could leave Islington, Barnsley and Islington, and, you know, trot into town and meet somebody for dinner, have a face-to-face discussion. So, you know, it's ironic that in a kind of, you know, in a situation where we're all locked back in our homes at the moment, that kind of face-to-face interaction is actually really important in a city, and it sells, and I think it certainly sells internationally, and has a value that's quite difficult to kind of put a figure on.
Okay, thanks for that. There's a question for you, Loretta, which is kind of shifting gear, because we've got 2 or 3 sorts of questions coming in, so I'm going to move us on a little bit from that. It's Loretta, do councils have to disclose the number of loss of homes for social rent in the planning applications for estate regeneration projects? It seems like this is often obfuscated.
Yeah. Alex, you've answered your own question. Yes, they do. You're supposed to write down how many council homes will be lost, how many new council homes are going to be developed, how many affordable, intermediate, owner-occupied properties, etc. However, this is often obfuscated, and one of the things that happens is that these numbers change constantly over time. So as people go back and forth, and certainly developers come in and say, well, actually, you know, 2 years later, I gave you that figure 2 years ago. I don't think that's economic now. We can't afford to do that now. So therefore, we're going to reduce the number of council properties. So they're not static numbers. And one of the problems we had actually with developing this database is the complete obfuscation of this data by local councils, many of whom don't collect this data and don't even know how many council properties they even own, which was even more shocking. If you don't know how many you own, how do we know how many we're about to lose? Mm-hmm. And secondly, that you know, the data is constructed in a very kind of hidden and complex way that you have to really kind of know what you're doing to unpick. So yes, it's a real problem, and it's part of this democratic deficit I've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, we really noticed that action on empty homes when we looked at council data also to do with second homes. It's not clear, empty homes, it's not clear. There's a whole kind of black box of stuff there where we really don't know what's going on, and there is a democratic deficit. There's no question about it. Rowland or Rex, do you want to pitch in on that one?
I was only going to say that I think that one of the things that's works marvelously well in slightly perverse and unintended ways is also that austerity has made local authorities beggars on the scene, you know, sort of scrabbling around for investment, or having underfunded planning departments that struggle to challenge a lot of what goes on, or in relation to what we're talking about right now, that, you know, the capacity to audit, the capacity to challenge, the capacity to regulate private landlords, and so on and so forth, has been torn out of many local authorities over the last decade. So at the local level, even with the best will in the world, you know, and quite often the goodwill is not there, but even with the best will in the world, the capacity to regulate and to police, I'm not talking about National Crime Agency and the sort of laundering stuff here, is I can't remember what the figure now is in terms of, you know, the absolute bulk of planners in London now work in the private sector. They're not working for local authorities, for example. I'd just like to add here, there's a website,
Who Owns London, Shropshire and his colleague. And on one of those pages, it shows you the local councils who are, it shows you local councils who are almost, I wouldn't say begging, but making themselves amenable for offshore investment in their borough.
Yeah.
I think it's a very good website. I'm recommending it. People want to have a look and see what's going on. But that is something I noticed. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, just to come off the back of that, I have one of my PhD students who followed some of Haringey's council, who were looking at redevelopment in Tottenham, to the south of France to a big property developer conference. And, you know, that speaks for itself. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is. I mean,
sorry to interrupt, Will.
Yeah.
I think the local councils are in a kind of an unenviable position as well, because they've been squeezed by central government.
Yeah.
So resources have been, if you like, taken away from the local councils, and it means that they have to try and recoup them wherever they can. Obviously, they think the kind of offshore money is a good idea to try and recoup them. And indeed, many people think because I see a few wine bars and a rooftop garden that the area is a better area. I have lots of evidence to suggest that that might not be so, but that's open for debate.
Okay, so Patricia says, how do these affordable homes keep being built on council property and land, but only a bare minimum or less go to social housing tenants? How can we get involved to increase the number of properties that go to social housing from these developments? And there are a number of questions coming in about what we can do, but if we can go to the first part of the question first, and then I'll bring in the question of activism towards the end of the discussion. That's okay?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question. So in other words, to paraphrase it, how are councils getting away with kicking out council tenants and replacing them with supposedly mixed income communities that are predominantly for owner occupation? Good question. One of the reasons they're getting away with this is the kind of long-term impact of something called mixed communities policy, which was brought in by the new Labour government and actually did have quite a sensible kind of social justice tissue to it in terms of trying to improve people's quality of life, quality of their housing, social capital, etc. But the reality of it is that it actually creates forms of gentrification, so that when you use mixed communities policy to socially mix an area like a council estate by bringing in kind of middle income people, the kind of trickle down effect that New Labour hoped would happen doesn't happen at all, because the policy itself became a kind of panacea for really kind of creating en bloc forms of gentrification in some of these neighbourhoods. Again, part of the reason that councils have gotten away with this is democratic deficit. There's been no kickback. There has been a number of public inquiries. The Haygate estate in Southwark became a kind of classic example of what not to do as a local council. And Southwark Council now would, pretty much hold up its hand and say that was wrong, to kick out 3,000 plus council estate residents. And none of those guys got to move back at all to the Haygate estate. That's now not happening. People are getting to move back, but still in smaller numbers than they should do. And of course, when they do get to move back, it's not to what they left. It's not to the property they lived in before, the community they lived in before. It's something totally different. So even if you get to move back, so the work we've done on the Ocean Estate in Newham, your experiences of a completely different community, your sense of place is disrupted, your neighbours are different, your social networks are still disrupted. So even if you do get to move back, it's not necessarily what it says on the box.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, actually. If you travel around London, you see these places being transformed. You see the estate demolition going on. You see the buildings going up. And Alexandra Jamal wants to ask a question: what do members think about the scale of building in London? Stratford and Old Oak are unprecedented in scale, not to speak of scores of other sizable development. They say, is it mostly for foreign capital? And I think the word foreign is quite interesting here, or the continued trend of absorption of educated people into the service industry. What's going on there? Any offers?
I can try and start on that. I mean, that's actually a big question, and geography is really important there, in the sense that the demographic or the investment profile, if you like, is going to vary massively depending on the location. So I think in those two developments, you're not going to see so much offshore international interest. I mean, if you're looking at the very apex of the market and the money sort of flowing in from there over the last decade, a lot of that is fueled by a sort of a map in one's head that at the centre of which is sort of Harrods, Mayfair, the West End of London, Houses of Parliament, and all the rest of it, and the accessibility to those kind of core areas. So there is a question about, where I often think, where do people get the money to even buy at the modest end of the kind of new stuff that's being produced in a lot of those locations. So it is the case that you will find, for example, Hong Kong or Chinese money going in to buy apartments to let out. You've seen that in the East End of London and other sort of new developments and so on. I guess we could say, at the moment, all of that's looking terribly shaky, but I think the fundamentals are all still there. You've seen what a kind of bounce, even just the prospect within 6 months, a year of vaccines had in terms of stock markets and so on. I think who is it for is a very good question. Part of the reason why the reason that people can afford that is because people are being lent more money as well to invest in those schemes. The banks have been lending greater multiples, which has helped sort of underwrite what's been happening there. So buy to let out, buy to leave. I've seen buildings that I would describe as buy to rot. You should literally buy something, and I could take you to various streets in the north of London where people bought very large mansion houses, and they're almost literally sort of falling down and so on. So there's different motivations depending on the particular strand, and we haven't talked. None of us have talked about Airbnb and those kind of processes as well. So it's all kind of very variegated. I suspect the whole kind of high-rise boom is, if not going to come crashing down, but really stall as a result of what's going on, because the disaster in terms of high-density commercial as well as residential is very likely to really, if you haven't got money in the game right now, you would probably be saying, let's just not carry on with that development, but we will see.
I mean, can I come off the back of that from Rowland? Because I think he's right. I mean, many of the developments that I've been looking at in Southwark were bought by mostly Chinese investors, and they were either left as kind of ghost units, as they call them, just sitting there kind of, as a kind of lowly bubbling investment. Or what's really interesting is they were then would bring their children over to go to university here. So international Chinese students who, of course, now, as the media is telling us, they're no longer coming to the UK to British universities. If they don't come, what are they going to do with those units they've bought to put their children up in? And certainly in Vancouver, they did the same thing. Chinese overseas investors, particularly Hong Kong Chinese, bought up lots of housing in Vancouver, massively inflated the market, often put their children in them when they went to university there, or for the last 4 years of high school, to get into some of the better Vancouver universities. So the big question now is, if that market's disappeared, as Rowland said, I suspect there'll be some form of collapse around this.
Yeah. I mean, Rex, do you want to throw something into that?
No.
I mean, I noticed a couple of months ago in the financial pages, there were student accommodation companies going bust. And what was interesting about the student accommodation companies going bust was that the individual flats, the very small micro flats, actually the investment had been made by people with pensions, and they'd sold them their investment in the little micro flat. And because the company went bust, they lost their pension. And so I think there are a lot of people quite vulnerable, actually, to that kind of collapse. And,
I just had one thing, Will. The Airbnb thing has completely collapsed.
Is that everybody's view? Definitely, right?
Definitely. I'm looking at myself, and some others are looking at some data, as sketchy as it is, and there's going to be a kind of a huge issue with Airbnb. I guess, as Rowland says, people have short memories. So if and when we get past COVID, then perhaps, we can see a return. But for the moment, there's quite a problem.
So do we think there's going to be a change in the shape of what's going on in London, or do we think there'll be a wobble and then it will return to the norm? Because you've made a very strong argument about why it's a centre for financial investment, and the role of the City of London, the role of property. So are they just going to go through a wobble, or are we seeing something else going on as well?
I think Rowland is right. Rowland says people have very short memories, and I think it will be business as usual if we get past COVID. I also do think, though, it's a good moment for civil society, because I do think this is the moment, if there's any moment that we can press for some types of change, a more equitable distribution of housing resources, this has to be the moment. Yeah.
You've just prompted me to go back to a question we had early on, just after your introduction, Rex. So it says, Rex mentioned, it's from Leeds Bailey, Rex mentioned the regeneration of Bon Marsh in Brixton. Has he seen the recent campaign to save Arnold Cash and Carry? Does this tell us anything about the activism and about activism in wealth investment? What do people think?
I'm sorry, I don't know that. I don't know that particular campaign.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Loretta, you were nodding there. Have you picked up on it?
Yeah, I know it's a shop because I know somebody who used to shop there who actually pointed me in the direction of this particular campaign. And I think what's been really interesting for me, because of course I'm not just an academic, I'm also a scholar activist who, hopes to try and make change in the same way that, Rowland and Rex would aspire to. But, one of the things that London also has not had is a massive history of anti-gentrification activism. And if you compare it to New York City, where there has been a quite big and quite vocal kickback against gentrification since the 1980s. It's only really in recent years that it's begun to emerge in London. And I think that's a really interesting difference between these two cities. But what I do think is that the kickback that's emerged in London more recently is having more punch. And I think it's going to have more punch. And I think that one of the problems we need to get on top of is bringing these different campaigns together. So there's lots of mini campaigns across London, but they're not hooked up properly. And, we've talked about this before, but it's a real tricky question. How do you get them to hook up? Because, of course, they're all slightly contextually different. But at the end of the day, they're all trying to fight for the same thing.
Yeah. Rowland, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I like to think that the system has reached a kind of tilt point and that there's limits. But I think there's more and more people concerned about what's going on now, and that brings actually in the politics of a kind of a patrician conservatism with a small c that sees a sense of social hierarchy, but is not so wedded to ideas of letting it rip, and it's all about markets, it's all about money. The limits of that are really visible now, and the dysfunctions of it in terms of the livability of the city, in terms of the quality of the built environment, and in terms of I suppose the feel of the city. And I think I remember being at a presentation where quite a wealthy attendee said, why won't they integrate? And what he was talking about was the super wealthy people moving into their neighborhood. So there's a sense in which, there's obvious things like, you can't get cleaners in the city of London because it's a 2-hour commute for everybody now, and it becomes more like the sort of Paris model. But I think I would say, I think, yes, back to bad, as I say, I think bad normal. The fundamentals here are so powerful. In terms of who's got the ear of politicians. Many politicians are signed up to, principles of market exchange, market allocation, so on. And that's because it's advantaging people like them and they themselves, to be. Anyway, sorry.
Can I just to chip in here? It's interesting you mentioned that, Loretta, because I was in conversation with somebody who is an activist with the Latin Village, and I'm doing work around the community plan for Holloway, and this has been going on for a long time. And we've managed to snatch an hour to have a conversation with each other. Yeah, and the same with Peach. People's Empowerment and Customs House. I had a very brief, incredibly informative conversation. I learned so much from them. Yeah, and it just strikes me that we need something. Some resource to network these people, because everybody's doing really valuable work and they're learning stuff, and we could all strengthen each other. I mean, just the question that on Rex.
Can I just interrupt there?
Yeah.
I said this is the moment, but I'm sitting here thinking as we talk of Bob Colnutt's book.
Yeah.
And yes, it is the moment. But when you read that book, you get a sense of the forces that we're up against. These are enormous forces. They are very, very powerful forces.
Yeah.
And in terms of knitting the thing together, anti-inequality, I think that is probably the most important task, because these guys are extremely well organized with incredible amount of resources. So that's the word of caution.
Yeah, no, Sorry,
So,
go on.
I was going to say, I mean, the other thing not to underestimate is what they call disaster capitalism. So, kind of exploit when a disaster like COVID, like Brexit, if that's how you see it, happens
Never
in
let a
a
good crisis
capitalistic
go to
system and
waste.
creates cracks, etc. There will be vultures going in to maximize their profit, to maximize their money. And of course, this is my kind of Marxist hat, but you look at New Orleans after the floods and what happened there, you look at other cities around the world where there's been some form of disaster. It has not just disappeared. It hasn't necessarily gone back to the new norm. In some cases, it actually got worse. So, there could also be a scenario, and I think we need to recognize the different scenarios where things actually get worse. And that really, really worries me.
I follow private equity funds, and these guys are really shopping for bargains.
Yep.
That's what, and they're buying up a lot of stuff. So again, go ahead, Rowland.
I was almost going to make the same point. Because I think you switched me on to something saying, the level of borrowing that's going on in order to take advantage of the depressed cost of housing and other assets in a city like London. Get it while it's cheap, and watch it bounce back. This is cash rich.
There are. I've been hearing personal reports of people selling homes and being visited by online estate agents who are saying to them, there are lots of wealth investors who would buy your property at the right price. Right. At the right price. And the same, I've been talking to colleagues in New York and Melbourne, and the same thing is happening there. So they're kind of gearing themselves up for a bit of a swoop, even at individual house levels. You can see it happening. I mean, Ben Rodney, just to take us back to the question about campaigning, he says it feels like we're going round and round in circles on housing. He asked this at 7:30, so thank you for waiting. Whilst housing campaigns like Sweets Way, West Hendon, etc. have made some gains, they have ultimately failed. These were years ago now. How can we act more radically and productively? How can we act quicker in the initial planning phase? And Ben, that's a fantastic question. That's a question we asked ourselves at the community plan for Holloway. How could we have acted faster? What do our speakers think?
Loretta, isn't this about if they watch as an infrastructure to support that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult because you do need to act quickly. And the problem is that, people don't always, as we've shown, people don't always know what's happening as it's happening, so they kind of get steamrolled, and it's only 5 years down the line they reflect back and think, so that was happening then, that's what that meant. But the new Estate Watch website that we've kind of developed is really as an information base so that people can understand what's happening as part of this process. So we're hoping that will be one step. But I think we do need to hook up, as Will was saying, these different groups, because, many of them have done the same research. And what it does is it stops new groups having to do that research again. If you've already done it and proven that something works or doesn't work, then it kind of frees up time and space for them to do something else. But I think we also don't need to be too negative, because I think there have been wins along the way. So, it'd be pretty unusual now, I think, for a council to get away with what happened on the Haygate estate. I can't imagine any council in London now would get away with getting rid of 3,000 people and not bringing some of them back to that site. The GLA has woken up. We now have ballots. We've now got pressure for proper consultation, although, of course, there's an argument what that proper consultation might look like. So there have been movements, but the tricky bit now is to use that kind of rather opaque legislation and make it work. And that's really what we're trying to do, certainly around ballots, because the scary thing is there are states out there that are now saying yes after everything that's happened and all this kind of displacement and all the kind of disruptions that have happened. They're still saying yes to the regeneration stroke demolition of their estate. That's really quite scary.
No, it's not great, is it, at all? I think this is meant to be a sort of an optimistic input here, because I am quite optimistic that we can affect change. I really am. I think we can do it. We just need to work together as a block, I think. Frank says there's been a lot of talk recently about rents falling in the wake of COVID-19, especially with the supply increasing due to former Airbnbs. Can renters in London and elsewhere genuinely hope to benefit from this? or is this just a more high-end phenomena? So is there kind of weirdly some good news that we're going to have all this stuff coming onto the market? What do people think? Or is that guessing?
I doubt it's good news.
Why not?
Well, I think I mean, the good news is if it's a permanent switch out of Airbnb into permanent private rental accommodation, and that increases the supply, I don't really think that's going to sort of suddenly tilt rental yields or prices right down. But I think that the obvious caveat is going to be that, let's say, come a vaccine or a different way of living, more effective treatment or whatever, that those landlords will be looking for the best buck. And if the best buck comes from being back in the Airbnb game in 6 months or a year, all of that stuff will be back in there. So I very much doubt that the fundamental incentives to be an Airbnb landlord under the right circumstances have gone away. So I personally doubt that it's good news. Yeah.
Now, I'd just like to answer the question with my economist hat on. That really depends. Can renters benefit? To a large extent, depends on what happens in the rest of the economy in terms of work, employment, etc., precarity, and so forth. If we have, as some people claim, Anthony Haldane, for instance, from the Bank of England, that we have a rather short-lived recession, a V-shaped recession, then I think Rowland would be on point. He would be correct. If, as I suspect, it's going to take somewhat of a longer time period, then I'm not sure that renters, on balance, I am not seeing that renters would benefit, because I think we're going to have a longer recession than many people suggest. And I think that jobs, incomes, etc., will be hit very, very badly.
So the other thing to say on this, Will, is that when I read Frank's question, I was forgetting the other possibility that when he says flooding the market, he means landlords deciding to sell. And of course, right now, they probably can't do that. But it actually might be very good if they were helped to sell, and they could be selling to local authorities who somehow could be empowered with an infrastructure fund to buy those funds and put those into the social rented sector. Or if they were being sold into owner occupation, that would also be a good thing, I think. My preference would be to move. I mean, London is 50% owner occupied, 25% social, 25% private. If the more you can do to set up a housing system that's moving towards, let's say, 50% owner occupation, 50% social rented, disincentivize the private rented sector as much as possible. I don't think that's terribly radical. There's always this thing about what would we do if those landlords decided not to be landlords anymore? How could we continue to be private renters? I mean, that completely misunderstands the issue here in terms of what are the incentives and who's just cashing out of that system and benefiting at the expense of others. I really think stigmatizing private landlordism is really important right now. I think that's the way we've had 30, 40 years of the stigmatization of social rented housing, and that has underwritten exactly the kind of policy actions that Loretta's been talking about. Let's say that, it's not good to be a private landlord. People should not be private landlords. And okay, we can understand at the margins how and why some people might get themselves into that situation, but to strategically invest in that way is problematic, I think, particularly in the kind of current context.
Yeah.
I mean, I have an issue with this, because if Airbnb start to rent out privately rather than through Airbnb, yes, it increases the private rental market, but we go back to that kind of Victorian city model where you've got these kind of shabby, under-regulated private sector rentals that dominate housing, and it does nothing for low-income groups who really what they need is council housing, and not housing association, not private rent. They need council housing because there are inbuilt protections into council tenure that protect you from eviction if you lose your job, if you're on a 0-hour contract or whatever, and all the kind of things that are just going to escalate as part of a kind of post-COVID recession.
Yeah.
I think we might be able to learn something from Barcelona here. I saw, I didn't read the thing entirely, but I saw where the city council was going to seize properties and put them into social use if they were left empty for more than, I can't remember the period, I suspect it was a month. That seemed to me quite radical, and maybe we could tap into that to look at how that works and try and push for that, something like that.
Yes, and they've also done that in the Balearics in Spain as well. So they've kind of brought in more rigor in private renting over 10 houses. So if you don't rent them out, we're going to take them over and ensure that they are rented out. So, which is really, really interesting, I think. There's stuff going on here and there. I mean,
Lisbon and Berlin have legislated really big kind of anti-Airbnb legislation. We haven't really done that in London. We've kind of just ignored it and let it kind of float away. Perhaps now's the time that we can get on top of that.
Yeah. Another optimistic note. Paul Burnham from Haringey says, Haringey stopped the development company that would have demolished 4,500 homes. This involved the deselection of 22 councillors and a change of council leadership following a battle in the Labour Party. We also had 5 or 6 states where the councillors backed down on demolition schemes. We started campaigning at the very beginning. So it can be done. It can be done. It's a really interesting situation where we are facing, as you know, the property lobby, Bob Colnock's book expresses, very powerful forces. But also, if we organise, it is possible for people to stop these projects and stop the emergence of underutilised and empty properties and unaffordable properties across the capital. So I would like to
relieve the local population of the extreme trauma and stress of having to go through that process, and have a policy, housing policy framework that speaks of no net loss of social housing. Of that demolition is not a preferred model by any stretch, that you will struggle to get finance for that. You will not be allowed access to private capital to demolish housing that was designed and built in perpetuity to resolve housing need. The very fact that even on the table during, none of this, we would have been talking about a housing crisis 10 years ago in a very similar way to how we are tonight. And the idea that you would suffer net losses of public housing is quite extraordinary, and not talk about rehabilitation, not talking about something at the margins that tweaked, that remodeled, reworked and improved those spaces, because we know that there was plenty of money around, and there's still plenty of money around, but we didn't have Thomas Piketty then, but we now know how much the rich have been getting richer while everybody else has been suffering. That's the good news story actually right now. There is a lot of money out there. And maybe we'll get more ingenious about how to access it. And even those on the political right will get on board with that, because they're compelled to, because of COVID, because of the cost of the crisis.
Yeah, they found the magic money tree. Sorry, look, go on, Laura.
Can I just respond to Paul, though? I mean, there's 2 points I want to make. Firstly, that many Labour-led London boroughs are the ones that have been the most proactive in terms of supporting the demolition of council estates. And I think that politically, the Labour Party needs to really be doing some serious kind of listening to people who are on the ground and have kind of produced the research, including yourself, on these processes, and actually legislate it into their thoughts for new urban policy and new housing policy, because they should be supporting that kind of remnant of the welfare state. I think, secondly, Haringey is not out of the war zone yet. Love Lane, which I've been working on, is still under threat of demolition. Broadwater Farm, Northumberland Park, there are still demolition threats. So, the HDV may have been blocked, but there are localized demolitions still ongoing, and those threats have not gone away. We still have people in power in Haringey who are supporting that. So I think the politics of this are really quite complex. What we actually need is a kind of cross-party support from every political persuasion now to actually sit down and talk through what's going on and come up with some decent solutions.
Yeah, Chris Bailey makes the comment, he's campaign manager at Action and Empty Homes, I should say. He makes the comment that given Rowland's comment on Airbnb rising again, does that take us back to the need for a fundamentally different national government approach to social housing investment, regardless of our hopes of getting that? So that kind of is filling in what you were talking about, isn't it, at a kind of governmental level? Just one thing which I think I should bring in, which has been a question about from Alex Engel, which takes us very briefly off into a different place for the last few minutes, which is there any hope in the recovery idea that is circulating?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I guess it comes back to the question about optimism and how much of an inflection point we are at, and whether the voices are there. That I think we might hope very much for a different constellation of political institutions and key actors right now at the moment that the globe and the city, faces in terms of challenges. And I don't think it looks very good. We might have hoped that 10 years ago we were seeing much greater investment in solar, in steering innovation and government money into research that would secure our economic base into the kind of future that we might hope to be moving into now. But I'm not very hopeful about this. I think it's kind of flaming ball, spinning through space soon type scenario. Really, I think the emergency is so profound now that it's enormously unsettling to have that going on in the background. But it is not seeming to really steer the kind of political conversations that we need to be having at the moment. I really think it's going to be back to real estate agents, developers, and others saying, we want this money from abroad to come in to build this tower, shiny new tower. And so, a lot of this is just about the circulation of capital. It's just financial widgets, transfers, pension funds, and all the rest of it, without any sort of touchdown into people's real lives or the production of something valuable. So I'm not very optimistic on that one, I have to say.
Okay, any thoughts from Rex or Loretta?
Well, my concern is that a green recovery would translate into green gentrification, which is a whole big new debate now in the gentrification literature, whereby greening is being used as a kind of policy tool to gentrify, and that would be really, problematic.
Yeah.
I would echo Loretta there. We've seen that in parts of Miami, Florida. We've seen it in parts of Milan. I would definitely echo Loretta there. Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to read out a comment by Ebony Kingston, which is, Ebony says it's cheaper to fill in empty properties and refurbish them than to demolish them and start again. So she's arguing that it's better to refurbish empty properties than to get rid of them, and I think that's another way of coming in on the green angle as well, and I kind of agree with that.
The richer you get, the less that logic applies. I can take you to many places, in fact, across London, where an arts and crafts mansions, wonderful, beautiful homes have just literally been torn down, and something even larger has been built in its place. And that kind of logic, where there's no sense of value or concern with cost, is the disaster really that's kind of happening under the radar quite often. Yeah.
If I may say this, there's an idea of resilient housing, and I don't know if that's the same. I think it's slightly different from green housing. Resilient housing are the houses, the buildings under threat from climatic change, floods, and so forth, etc. There may be an opportunity for us to push through on that front, depending, I think, on if next winter we have a lot of floods in particular parts of the city, then I think that you can see more of a clamor for resilient housing. But I'm not sure if it's actually green housing. I think it falls in a different category of resilient housing.
I mean, just on that point that Ebony's made, she's completely right. In the Aylesbury Public Inquiry, there was an architectural firm that was brought in to show that I think it was £13,000 per unit of housing if you were to refurb it, in comparison to them spending 50 million on just ejecting people off the Haygate alone. I mean, it is a lot cheaper, but it also is a lot more green because it's carbon, it counts in all the kind of carbon costs of demolition and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and the last refurbishment, the last kind of program that the coalition government did, they refurbished a lot of empty homes for around 18,000, actually. Yeah. So it can be done, and it really should be done. Look, I'm going to have to stop us now. We've run out of time, which is a real shame. But I did promise everybody that we'd finish at 8:30. Do you have any final comments, brief final comments? Or have you talked yourselves out? Go on, Loretta, you didn't take a breath there, go on.
Well, I think it's about weighing up the alternative visions that we have for our future. And I think it's about trying to stay positive, because we can get kind of, pushed down by some of the negativity around this stuff. But if we try and stay positive, we can start to push things forward, I think.
I agree. Rowland?
Keep shining a light upwards. I think the pressure's on right now. The WikiLeaks style data dumps, the more we know much more about wealthy people, where they're holding it, where it's going. Rex is doing fantastic work on that front. Absolutely. And that's going to generate pressure. And where you have action and agency to effect some kind of change locally or through the votes that you have, you should pursue that as far as possible. Yeah. But things are going to change, I think, in that respect. Yeah.
Rex?
Change has got to come.
Okay. Before we end, in a minute, I need to do two things. One is I need to direct you to the Action on Empty Homes website. Please sign up for our bulletin. Please get involved with what we're doing. Over the next couple of years, we'll be going to be running campaigns in London and Manchester on the themes that we've explored in this meeting. We're also going to be developing local campaigns across the country to address the problems we've heard about tonight. Because where London has gone, they might not follow in the same way as we've heard tonight, but there are issues that will need to be addressed. And we're looking to collaborate with individuals and organisations and activist academics. Are my favourite breed of academics. So the bigger network we can build there, the better. That's the first thing. The second thing is I need to thank, first of all, our audience. And I think we got up to 50 plus this evening for this event, which we're really pleased with. And for participating and asking questions and making the event work so well. I want to thank the Action on Empty Homes staff and volunteer team for bringing this meeting together. I just had the basic idea. They did all the work around this. And a special mention for Rebecca Eng, who set up all the technical aspects and showed me how to do it. I had no idea what I was doing, but she led me through it brilliantly. And last of all, I'd like to thank our three speakers for their illuminating introductions and their contributions. So thanks to all of you. See you soon.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Stay where you are if you could.